The disaster occurred at October 13, 1972, when Uruguayan Air Force Flight 5571, with 45 passengers and crew members on board, left Montevideo, Uruguay for Santiago, Chile. There were 45 individuals on the aircraft, including members of Uruguayan rugby team, their friends and relatives. Their flight was to be an ordinary one, and just as they approached the Andes high ranges, the flight would turn out to be a fatal one. The aircraft was Fairchild FH-227D, which faced adverse weather at close proximity to the mountains. This was disorienting for the crew. The fact is, they had been blown off course by strong wind, and moreover visibility was low. The plane flew into a remote and treacherous part of the Andes, and at around 3:30 p.m., disaster struck. The plane comes into the steep, snow-covered peaks and immediately burst into pieces on the mountainside, just like it exploded. By this, the survivors were thrown into tog. Most were left critically injured, some annihilated, and they never thought the lone, desolate region surrounding them posed their biggest threat. A large area of the snow-covered ground was covered with debris, and injured people were unable to communicate with the environment in the first few hours. Suitcase, water from the river, Kaylin's diary, Enion's shirt, 2 jackets, orange shorts, banana, shoes, photo of mom, knife. The fuselage was twisted and shredded, but was better than nothing when it came to protection. Many passengers were hurt and included the captain, who was found to be unconscious. Some of the survivors were Nando, Parrado, a rugby player, and Roberto Canessa, who was a medical student. Both would assume a dominant status in the unfolding history of survival. The inhabitants attempted to logically apprehend their environment for the first few days. They had very sparse ration, and the climate at those high altitudes encouraged freezing temperatures. To find shelter, they scavenged whatever they saw fittings and made themselves homes out of the wreckage. But the reality was to prove that their condition was utterly critical rather quickly. There was little hope of rescue, since they had to wait in the mountainous area of Andes, where everyone didn't stand to even a small probability to chance upon them. Day by day, new evils befall the survivors. That food they managed to get, mostly biscuits and sandwiches. They got on the plane, finished very fast. They were freezing, the kids were starving, and they all bore with some kind of pain or the other every single moment. The hardest thing they needed to assess was the fact that there seemed to be no rescue, perhaps in the process. These factors, and such as the weather, the terrain, and the location of the area, ensured that anyone who wanted to get to the wreckage would find this very hard to achieve, since it was located on the mountainous region. On the 6th day, the survivors got to know that the search for them had ceased. The authorities, who deemed it impossible to find the airplane, had stopped the search attempt. Whatever was left remained there with no chance of getting a rescue in the near future. At this point, the group had a hard time deciding what they have to do, or probably what they wanted to do. There were no other choices when it came to food or beverages to take. They survived on the melting snow, and the water could only help them because they were all famished. Finally, the survivors were forced to kill their fellow human beings and devour them in an attempt to survive the time when there would again be no food available for them. This, they would later claim, was due to force them to survive. But it was something they could never escape for the rest of their lives. The morale within the group began to deteriorate as days passed. Hope was lost, and the majority of the people who survived to that point began to think that they would die in the hills. But 2 men, Nando Parrado and Roberto Canessa, they weren't ready to die yet. Finally, on the 10th day, due to their current state, they decided to leave the site of wreckage and look for any assistance. Finally, they left on foot for populated areas, but encountered a difficult ground. They had high chances of not surviving the trip. At times for days, they crossed the mountains, just with what little means they could afford to get over the terrain. It's fateful that even if the population was weak and injured, it could have saved the rest of the population that was still alive. In the end, having been through extremely adverse circumstance, frost, heights, and fatigue, Canessa and Parrado came across a Chilean shepherd who went for help. I am proud to say that finding 2 of the survivors was the turning point. Emergency crew rushed to the scene, and over the next days more people were evacuated from the crash zone. When the first helicopter came, the survivors, who starved and terrified, were evacuated one by one. It was a grim victory for Miss Beaumont. The climax of the most narrowing experience of her young life was at last ended. And though there was a way to be made, it was the way of sorrow and regret and painful memories that would linger with her as long as she lived. From the 45 passengers and staffs that were on the flight, only 16 of them were alive. They had had to give the impossible choices, suffer the conditions that could not be thought of, and had to survive by their own wit, willpower, and, perhaps, faith in each other. The survivors were in effect postmodern heroes, not only brave, but having the will to live when everything was denied to them. The latter, for many years, get asked a question of what choice they had made in moments that could very well be defined as moral. First, interviews, books, and documentaries connected their story, and their suffering was called the miracle of the Andes. They were reporting on how close they had become when trying to survive, and reporting on the feelings of guilty and loss when their loved ones lost their lives. Among them, some of them were very lucky in their future life. But to all of them, the memories of Andes will remain all their lives. To Nando, Parrado, and Roberto Canessa, that ever-appalling walk through the mountains in search for help became a symbol of human spirit. Their survivor's tale was arguably one of the most well-chronicled of human endurance and vitality, in the light of hope in the very adversity of existence.